Welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. My name is Alex Sakin, and today I have a really great episode for you. This episode is going to be following up the previous episode, which was based on my article that was on Mahayana Buddhism. It was called Mahayana Buddhism, A Guiding Light for the New Age. And the subtitle is The Aryan Wisdom Tradition Descends from the Brahmins to the Buddhists. And this is continuing in the series that we've been doing, tracking the origin and descent of the wisdom tradition. And this is all part of a larger book that's going to come together. It's going to be called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And this is a project that is a long time coming, and I'm very excited to be putting this material out. And so the last 5 episodes have been the first 5 chapters of this book, and there will be 8 more to come. Actually, 7 after this one. So this is going to be the 6th episode in the series, and the series is going to come together to form a book. And the book's going to be called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And so the previous episode we did was on Mahayana Buddhism, and the follow-up episode, which I just finished the article that it's going to be based on, is also on Mahayana Buddhism, and it's going to be focused on unfolding their doctrine of, I guess, their spiritual cosmology or their emanationist doctrine. And this is going to be touching on or going over the archetypal themes involved with the cosmic creation process. And so we're going to be studying this process in the language of Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism in particular. And so that'll be the topic of the next article. And really the stage for that material was set by the previous article, which kind of lays out the more historical aspect of the significance of the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism. So we set the stage in that previous article and in the previous podcast episode. And then now in the next one, we're going to be talking about the actual content of the religious philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism. So that's what's coming up. I did just finish the article. It's a long one. I might break it up into 2 parts because it's almost 30 pages just on the Word document. And the normal length for the articles has been between like 11 and 15 or so. So it's a lot longer, but it's very comprehensive, and it's oriented toward overviewing the Mahayana Buddhism's doctrine of the Messiah. And this is personified in their figure of Maitreya, the Maitreya Buddha. So by going over the whole spiritual cosmology, I'm going to be setting the stage to teach what this doctrine of the Messiah is all about. And we're going to be able to, if we understand it through Buddhism, you can understand it through Christianity or mystic Christianity, because the Buddha, or the principle that they call Buddha in the religious philosophy of Buddhism, is the same as the principle that they call Christ in the religious philosophy of Christianity. And so the Christ principle and the Buddha principle are the same thing. The Buddha principle references an old Sanskrit name for the term that the Buddha is meant to embody. This principle he's meant to embody as a figure in religious philosophy. We talk about the Buddha. We're talking about a being that is of the essence of Bodhi, or who has manifested its consciousness through Bodhi. And Bodhi is a principle, so that's where the term Buddhism comes from. And then Christianity, on the other hand, that term Christ comes from Christos, and that's from the Greek lineage. So we have the Buddhism represents the Eastern lineage, and then we have this Western lineage that goes through Greece. And we know that the founding fathers of Christianity were heavily influenced by Plato, at least initially. Later on, Aristotle, but originally Plato, and so we can understand that Grecian influence also took the form of this more mystical interpretation of the Christ concept, which has to do with Christos. But that whole mystical tradition was had to go sub rosa in the West because it was actively persecuted. In the East, the mystical tradition wasn't actively persecuted to the same degree. So in Mahayana Buddhism, the esoteric doctrine and the exoteric doctrine are integrated together, along with the intermediary realm of idealistic philosophy that unites the two polarities. And that's the ideal form of this concept of the Sangha, or the school. This is the body of the esoteric doctrine, the body of the invisible government that we've been calling it, the overstructure of the world, the spiritual institution of mankind is this entity. So, Buddhism and Christianity are, sun and moon to each other. They're yin and yang, and if we can understand that, we can have a sort of a philosophically aware and enlightened rebirth of Christianity, which is what I think that is necessary. And so we're going to be getting into the ideas and the particulars of what I mean by that in this series, in the form of the previous episode, which sets the stage for this the Aryan cycle and how it relates to Buddhism. And we talked a little bit about Christianity, and I talk a little bit more about Christianity in this upcoming episode, just in terms of some of the relationships and similarities between the two. But I just want to emphasize now, maybe to a degree that I don't in the articles, but maybe I will in future unfoldments as we progress in this series, the idea that at the same time, around the 4th century AD, which was the end of the Age of Aries and the beginning of the Age of Pisces, we see Christianity born. At the same time, we see Buddhism turn into Mahayana Buddhism. At the same time, we see in the Alexandrian schools the emergence of all of the esoteric doctrines that would come out of there, such as Kabbalism and Hermeticism and Gnosticism and Neoplatonicism. So those systems that were born in Alexandria were intended to be the inheritor of, in the Western tradition, of this doctrine in the East that became Mahayana Buddhism. But the problem is the Orthodox, or the outer branch, the Christian church, behaved differently than the outer branch of Buddhism, which became the Hinayana school, or the Southern school. The outer body of Christianity persecuted the inner body, and so that sets up the drama or the chemistry by which really the age of Pisces would unfold, and the sort of the descent of, or the ascent, or however you want to look at it, of Western civilization would take off based on that chemistry. So the East is really where we see the wisdom tradition preserved, and then the West, in its highest form, I guess you should say, and in the West we see the emphasis, rather than be on preservation, we see it more on building the temple, building Earth as a temple, on initiation, building Earth as a temple of initiation. So that becomes this Western path, and the Eastern path becomes the path of preservation. And according to the system of esoteric philosophy taught by Blavatsky and Manly Hall and others, it's said that the Eastern wing, which is the preserving wing, is actually where the hierarchy resides. So this is the idea of the Mahatmas. So I go into all that to make the point that the Mahayana Buddhism system is particularly significant in trying to understand the wisdom tradition that has unfolded over the course of our age that we're calling the Arya, based on the traditional name for it, the cycle of the Arya. So the wisdom tradition associated with that has gone around the world and has been an inspiration over and over again for all the great unfoldments in philosophy that have taken place. But among those schools of philosophy, the Mahayana system is particularly relevant because it's the one that is closest in spirit to the original revelation. So this is why I'm spending so much time in this book and in this series on this topic of Mahayana Buddhism, because if you can understand this, you can understand all the other systems through analogy. And actually, when I was compiling my the content for this upcoming article that I'm about to publish, that's on the spiritual cosmology of Mahayana Buddhism, I often reference the tree of life from the Kabbalah, from the Jewish wisdom tradition, as a template to base some of my ideas, some of the framework I was putting together in terms of how things are organized. So, the tree of life is not just for Judaism, it's for the esoteric doctrine, or the Kabbalah, which exists in all philosophical systems. Every philosophical system has their own version of the Kabbalah. So the tree of life can be applied to any system. That's the idea of the esoteric doctrine is that there's one underlying esoteric system of philosophy behind all the outer exoteric bodies of the different philosophies and the different religions. So anyway, with this long introduction, setting the stage, we're going to move now into the lecture that we're going to be looking at today, which is on the topic of Mahayana Buddhism, but goes into a few things that I don't talk about in this series of articles so explicitly, or at least not up to this point. But these are very important, and so we're going to be diving right in and jumping off with Manly Hall's introduction. Again, this lecture is called it's called Mahamaya, Mother of the Buddha. And Maha means above or greater. You'll see this word Maha a lot, like Maha, the Maha Parinirvana, for example, is like the highest form of nirvana. So this idea of Maha is like the most elevated plane. So Mahamaya, Maya has many different connotations, but it means essentially the feminine principle. The mother is also, in its lower aspect, has to do with illusion, but the illusion is always deliberate, and it's provided by the mother for the benefit of experience for the masculine principle. So Mahamaya is really this ultimate anima concept, the idea that the female principle embodies the law to the highest extent, and then the role of the male principle or the yang principle is to follow the anima, or to follow the law as it moves. So that's the lesson we have to learn as beings who are moving in the earth. We're expressing across the earth, we're expressing yang in our life patterns here, and so we need to be oriented towards our anima. And so our anima should follow the anima, as they say. So the anima is the higher spiritual soul, which is at one with the law, at one with Mahamaya. So that's the underlying idea that we're going to be looking at in this lecture, this idea of the law, but we're going to be touching on a lot of topics that we do go into in the article series, and then we're also going to be looking at some stuff that is just for this episode that we're not going to be talking about in the other episodes. So kick it off, Manly Hall. Here we go.
Well, on the occasion of Mother's Day, I thought it might be interesting to explore one of the world's most unusual religious examples of motherhood, the birth of Buddha. In order to understand this, we have to depart, it seems to me, from most of the historical traditions and realize that from the beginning in India, practically every personification or personality involved in religious literature is present not as a person, but as the personification of a principle. The whole fable account, as we find it in the East, is a series of personifications. In the West, we think of these stories as historically true, although mystics have already done considerable to interpret the mystical experience of Jesus as a symbol of the Christ in ourselves. In India, this practice was followed from the most remote times and descended from Hinduism gradually into Buddhism. Some feel that Buddhism is a reformed Hinduism. This is not really true. I don't feel it, at least personally. I rather feel that Buddhism is simply a restatement of the basic principles which are found in the symbolism of Hinduism. In other words, the Buddhist is simply the continuation of a process of interpretation, to go back again to the original pictures, the original concepts, and trace them to their universal sources.
So basically the point he's making here, or the themes that he's going to be talking about, just to make them a little bit more specific to some of the things that we've been talking about, he's saying that the religious iconography of Buddhism, or you could say all the religious philosophies of the world, are intended to personify universal principles and not actual personalities. So Zeus, for example, is not a personality, but it's a principle. And the personality is part of a religious philosophy intended to give you an elevated understanding of what this principle embodies and how you interface with it and how it interfaces with you, and how you can master this principle. That's what it's all about, is understanding and then mastery. So that's the basic idea. And then we have, as two examples, something I've mentioned earlier, Buddha and Christ represent universal principles, or principles of universal consciousness within ourselves. And the practice of mythologizing or personifying abstract philosophical principles in order to instruct is one that descends from remote times, and I argue it's part of the descent of this Aryan traditions, this post-Atlantean tradition that's specific for our age, our stage of evolutionary development. And then lastly, Buddhism is an exteriorization or an externalization of the Aryan doctrine, progressing it and advancing it and evolving it from an earlier Hindu form. So the Brahmin caste of India was the original inheritors of this Aryan doctrine. And they participated in spreading it around the world. But ultimately, the orientation of the Aryan modifications to the previous Atlantean institutions is to prepare the collective body of mankind to embrace the higher esoteric aspects of philosophy. So at first, mankind needs to be recruited into philosophy, and then through philosophy, gradually elevated and prepared for the higher mystical aspects. And the idea is that all of mankind is to follow this road in the fullness of its evolution. Anyway, in this next clip, we're going to be looking at the Brahmin caste of the ancient Hindu Indian religion.
The early Brahmins were among the first to chart the structure of the universe. Long before Western man was interested in such matters, the savants of India and China had already more or less organized a concept of existence that survives with some modifications to the present time. Perhaps one of the most important differences between Eastern and Western astronomy is that in the East, the universe is alive. The universe is a living entity. The universe is both a principle and a being. It is not simply an aggregate of chemical processes. The very atmosphere of space is alive. Everything that involves change and backs the processes of evolution and involution, every law of the universe is alive. So we have the universe conceived as an entity, a vast being whose body nature is and God the soul. Everything is ensouled by a divine power. Everything is a manifestation of an infinite invisible. So the universe becomes the great symbol of the eternal from which it emerges. And therefore it was inevitable that in old Hinduism that science and religion should be considered as one form of knowledge. Because to them there could be no science without religion, and no religion without the cosmic science, which was the principal heritage of ancient India.
In this next section, we're going to be looking at how a little bit something that we've touched on before, which is the structure of the social structure of the school, and how it has an inner and outer element and a middle element. And this is actually going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about in the next clip, which is the caste system idea. So the idea that there is an inner and an outer aspect of religion that innately creates a polarity, and that polarity is the foundation of the caste system. So the apex of the caste system is different than class. Class, the apex of the system, is the richest person. The caste system, the apex is the priesthood, the illuminated ones. The Brahmins. The Brahmins were the apex caste. So we'll be looking at that in a moment. But this will be setting the stage for that.
Living in a universe of aliveness was a tremendous challenge to the mortal mind of man. a challenge which has never been fully accepted, even in India. The average Hindu is no more able to fully comprehend the vastness of his own theology than is the Westerner capable of understanding the overtones of his own sciences. Each is locked in a kind of literalism. In the East, this literalism is mythology. In the West, this literalism is materialism. The average person does not go beyond the surfaces of things. And the surfaces of things fall short or are inadequate to meet the unfolding need of human consciousness. So in the ancient system, it was necessary to provide a key to an unfolding theory that could never be outgrown, the theory of an eternally growing, operating, living creation. That what we might term as a cosmic being is actually a form of consciousness, of intelligence, and of enlightenment above and beyond mind.
Now, in this next clip, he's going to talk about the caste system, which is what I previewed earlier.
Now to go back to our India problem, because in India, the great Brahmanic system of theology was a science based upon a religion. This science resulted in the fantastic structure of a caste system, a system which perhaps had many infallibles that will soon be forgotten, but also had certain points of value that have to be considered. The caste system divided humanity into 4 levels, or general structures. The highest of these was the scholar and the sage. In the caste system, wealth was not included among the important patterns of career. Below the wise, the second caste, was the defender of the wise. And the purpose of this defender was to make sure that wisdom itself was never profaned, that there was never a time when the highest was not protected and guarded. This might cause some thought today, where if we suddenly came to the realization that militarism was part of a caste in India dedicated entirely to the protection of truth in its abstract form. In other words, it wasn't who won the battle. It was to protect the eternal values of universal law, to protect what we would term the 10 Commandments, the defenders of the faith of righteousness. Then the third caste was what we would call today average people. These were the ones who were the shopkeepers, the workers, the agriculturists, all those who had to do with the maintenance of the living standard of the people, the work people of the world, who were entitled to very high recognition for this. Those who loved to labor, and to whom labor was a religion, to serve others, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to heal the sick. These were the labors of mankind, and these were the labors primarily of the third caste, the caste that was concerned with making sure that the universal law was fulfilled in the commonplace, in the marketplace, in the store, in the home, and in the life of the average person who was never going to transcend a level of utilities. And the last caste was that of the outcasts, the Sudra. This was the caste not of the people primarily, not originally the people, who were born of a lower order. The Sudra was the individual who by nature was common, who by nature had no ideals and no integrities, who drifted about and became the basis of the unemployable, the criminal, and all those who preferred, in a sense, to remain unenlightened, to live as slaves to their own ignorance, and by this circumstance ending slaved by others. The Sudra represents, therefore, a person who, regardless of wealth, regardless of station, regardless of opportunity, goes from the cradle to the grave with no interest in the well-being of anyone except himself and his own. The individual to whom selfishness is a way of life, because selfishness is a supreme form of ignorance. The man who does not go to school may be learned. The man who is selfish is always ignorant. So these situations, taken literally, became more or less ridiculous. But lifted up to their level of principles, they had truths that are useful even in our day.
In this next clip, Mendenhall is going to move on and talk about how Buddhism represents a reform to this caste system and the underlying dynamics, that the underlying logic that justified it. And part of that was that the wisdom teaching needed to be preserved within a caste, and that's an old Atlantean archetype. So now we're breaking through that with Mahayana Buddhism, and that's what he's going to be talking about now. And a part of that big breakthrough is the incorporation of the mystical and meditational doctrine that's associated with Mahayana Buddhism, and how that was the element that was preserved within the caste system in the Brahmin caste. And now in Mahayana Buddhism, it's put into a new vehicle where it can be democratized.
Now, in the ancient system of thinking, we know that Buddhism, coming in, had as its purpose a transforming of certain East Indian symbolism into what later became Buddhist symbolism. The Buddhists did not destroy the gods of the Hindus, nor turn against them, nor declare them to be untrue or unreasonable. The Buddhist point of view was that these gods of the Hindus were not gods at all, except by man's appointment. He created them in the image of himself and bestowed most of his own virtues and vices upon his deities. These were attitudes, these were opinions, these were misinterpretations of principles. But the principles themselves, if they could be cleared, would be very noble and beautiful. It was just a case where, as the Buddhist point of view takes it, it was necessary to convert the gods of India and make Buddhists out of them. Make Buddhas out of the gods of India. Now, it was considered to be a little tricky, but it happened so smoothly, so gently, that it was merely a matter of deepening meanings. There was no conflict, really, between the conversion of the Hindu to Buddhism in the ancient time. He could accept it or not as he pleased. It wasn't important. But gradually, out of this situation, there rose a new estimation of the principles and purposes of deities. Now, in the Indian system, the old Vedic gods became more or less man-created aristocrats. They were based upon principles that were true. But in the course of time, the believers limited and narrowed down the qualities and attributes of their deities, changing embodied principles into personalities. It was part of the purpose of Buddhism to reverse this motion and to restore what it originally was intended to be, that all deities, like all mortals, are servants of truth, that the supreme purpose of the deity is the improvement of his creation, that he must be constant and continuously mindful of the needs of the creatures over which he has temporary government. These deities were therefore the Maharajas, the world kings, and they were honored and recognized, but Buddhism was a little leery of them. It recognized also that the tendency of the world king was to create more and more temporal empire. He wanted larger kingdoms. He wanted to conquer his neighbors. And while claiming to be a good Buddhist or claiming to be a devout Hindu, he went out and made war upon his brothers. These things Buddhism recognized as deficiencies due to lack of one important factor, namely that true religion is an internal experience. And without this internal experience, nearly everything else is inadequate.
So what we see in Buddhism is this idea of God as the teacher and the enlightener, rather than the king who becomes the tyrant. So the teacher becomes the enlightener with this new Buddhist reformation. And keep in mind now, remember the figures in Buddhism personify universal principles. So the term Buddha means enlightenment, and it doesn't represent a person but a state of God consciousness. And so a bodhisattva is a person whose principle of self, or sattva, embodies this principle of bodhi. So that you would call the enlightened individual a bodhisattva, but the Buddha is the background conscious state of consciousness that the bodhisattva that exists for the bodhisattva to embody. Now that state of consciousness has to already exist for a sattva or a self to rise to embody it. So that's an important point. So he's going to be talking about some of that coming up.
The term Buddha, of course, it comes from an ancient Sanskrit term, which means enlightened. Therefore, Buddha is not primarily a person, but a state of enlightenment, a condition. Now, the same might be true also if we consider the Western philosophies and religions. We may personify Jesus Christ, but a Christian has to live the philosophy, live that religion. Christ is perfected in the Christian. And in the East, Buddha is embodied in the person who keeps the rules. Now, the rules are very, very simple, basically, because enlightenment is a condition that arises from a series of changes in the character and conduct of individuals.
So he notes that Buddha means enlightenment, and that enlightenment is associated with the law, or more specifically, being at one with the law. And so the way of philosophy, or the way of the Buddhist philosophy, is to keep the rules, or to learn the law and then obey the law. And in this capacity, Gautama Buddha symbolizes the adept, or the bodhisattva, which is one who keeps the law. And so that's the ideal of philosophy. And then now this idea of law being the mother or the generator of enlightenment, or Buddha, we get this idea of Mahamaya, mother of the Buddha, which is the title of the lecture. So Mahamaya is this idea of the law. And then Buddha is the idea of the consciousness perfected in law. And so he's going to be unfolding this concept.
Therefore, we find the story brought into focus that Surya, the sun god, the god of all light, had a consort in Hinduism who carried the name of Maya. This consort was the feminine aspect of the sun. It was not originally a lunar divinity, but it was simply the transmission of light. It was not something inferior, something secondary, something dependent. It was, for the power that it personified, simply fulfillment. Everything that is right has to be fulfilled. Laws are made, but they must be kept. The knowledge is accumulated, but it must be interpreted in terms of common good. So in the ancient system, Surya, the sun, was the principle of infinite universal light, the light of reality, a light that is very different from just the sunball that we see in the sky. Surya was the light of the world. It was that power which bestowed upon everything that existed not only the power of life, but the power of intelligence, and ultimately the actuality of salvation. In other words, it was the Creator, the Preserver, and the Redeemer. It was the infinite reality upon which all other things depend. It is the light in things that make them live. It is the light in our eyes that makes us read a book correctly. It is light in our heart that gives us love. It is light everywhere that transforms the darkness of ignorance, selfishness, perversity, fear into a radiant internal enlightenment. This means, as even the Western mystics have clearly shown, a change in what man sees when he looks. The individual who is not enlightened looks upon a world of difficulties. The enlightened person looks upon a world in which universal principles are fulfilling themselves, regardless of whether we like it or not. But it is perfectly possible for the individual to enter into an intimate association or comradeship with this light. So in the beginning in this system we have light. And this light becomes the principle which is not visible light, physical light, such as we can see, but a light that transforms the inner life of everything that lives. A light that shines through the darkness of every uncertainty, imperfection, and incompleteness. Now, according to this concept, then, Maya would be this light in manifestation. The light per se is in the sun deity, but this light in manifestation becomes the instrument of the enlightenment of everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is not a secondary power. It is the Shakti is not merely a dependent. It is in this case a principle that can only manifest through an appropriate vehicle. And that appropriate vehicle is creation. And over this creation and all that it possesses and all that it contains is the principle of this one light coming home in everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is the fulfillment of the divine purpose, as that purpose is represented by the eternal maternal principle. In the Indian philosophy, finally, in spite of what we may think to the contrary, if we go back far enough to the roots of the Vedas and the great teachings of India, we find that the eternal, space itself, the infinite potential theater for the existence of things, that which is the root of everything and from which everything must come and to which it must return, is a feminine power. This represents the inevitable state of birth and rebirth, both of which are feminine potentials.
So here Manly Hall is talking about a very important point, which is the relationship between the sun and moon. And the sun and moon is something that you see in astrology and you see it in alchemy as well. And they represent the two principles, the masculine and feminine principle, or yang and yin. And Surya, who is the sun god, represents consciousness and its eternal state. And then Maya represents the consciousness in its manifested state. So the consciousness moves into creation through the lunar principle, which I think you can think of as mind. And so mind becomes the host of the principle of eternal consciousness within creation. And so consciousness and mind are the yin and yang aspects of creation. To understand the solar and lunar principles, you really have to be able to juggle the idea that all things have both in them. Coming up, he's going to be talking about the more about the Surya and Maya mythology and talking about how the Mahayana doctrine synthesizes this ancient concept of Surya and Maya. It synthesizes it with its Bodhisattva doctrine. So the Bodhisattva is somebody who has cultivated and awakened and released this feminine principle within themselves. And only once this feminine principle has been awakened and realized is the masculine principle then able to come into its full fruition. So there's a saying that the anima is intended to lead the animus, and this concept is going to be part of this Bodhisattva doctrine that is in Mahayana Buddhism. And again, we're referencing the relationship between the sun and moon, these principles in ourselves that are originally personified by Surya and Maya.
In this sense, therefore, we see the gradual transmission of this concept of Surya and Maya into the development of Buddhist legendary and lore. This legendary and lore divides abruptly into two schools, the northern and the southern. The southern school is far less florid than the northern. The southern school teaches that the only way that the individual can release himself from the great cycle of responsibilities and escape from the illusion of materiality is by entering holy orders, casting off all worldly possessions and going forth in humility and unworldliness along a path that must lead through the whole of life to death. Only when there is a complete renunciation of all material things can the curse of Mara, the Lord of illusion, be broken. About the beginning of the Christian era, in the northlands of India, on the borders probably of China, a new branch of Buddhism slowly emerged. This branch undoubtedly emerged because of the impact of the Buddhist principle upon the consciousness of its own believers. There was no inconsistency. There was no misinterpretation. There was simply a new realization of relationships in which it became no longer necessary to assume that the great invisible cause, this eternal life, this infinite light, was tyrannical. There was no reason to assume that reality or truth must be cruel. There was no idea or realization that it was necessary to be punished forever for the sins of the fathers. That there was no hope except by this strange path of renouncing everything, including self. As a result of this change of perspective, the second school, which became the northern school, or the Mahayana, became tremendously important in the growth of Asiatic peoples. One of the simplest examples of this point is the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, known in Japan and China as Kannon or Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy. It began in India as a male being, and early representations of it even in China are androgynous. But gradually it became a new being, for it was suddenly recognized or understood that mercy was strangely a heart aspect, that it was something, therefore, that belonged not to the creative processes, but to the redemption and release of creatures. And in this course of procedure across Asia, this deity became feminine, and is as feminine is recognized today among all Buddhist peoples. This constant motion, therefore, toward the feminine principle as beauty, as love and of grace, of forgiveness, of kindness, of dedication, resulted in the northern school developing an interpretation of the Buddhist teaching which is essentially happy, a joyous philosophy, a philosophy not built upon death or martyrdom, or sorrow or loss, but a philosophy based upon fulfillment, based upon the idea that doing the right thing is the most wonderful and radiant way to be happy. Then only one problem remained: how to know what is the right thing and how to find ways of understanding it. And to meet this, we have the story of the birth of Buddha, in which a certain number of very interesting factors not generally considered enter. According to one of the fables, and there are many, by the way, and some of them are in apparent conflict, but not if you think them through. In the beginning, Surya, the god of the sun, this being the infinite light, not the light that is physical or temporal, but the light that comes with every being who comes into the world. This light, Surya, approached the queen of a little kingdom in what is now southern Nepal, and being a very courteous thing, never being bombastic or tyrannical or despotic, the eternal light asked Maya the privilege of being born through her. He wouldn't do it. It wouldn't do it if she didn't want it that way. And at first she rather objected to the idea. But after a very beautiful story was told, she accepted and agreed that she would become the mother of the embodiment. Now, what was going to be embodied? In one school, the embodied being was a bodhisattva, a being approaching perfection, who had voluntarily accepted the ministry of coming into the world for the redemption of mankind. Another view of the entire principle was quite different. Instead of being a person, this Buddha was actually Bodhi. In other words, infinite soul power, seeking to be born as the redeemer of all that lives. Now, in the categories, particularly those we find also in Yoga and Vedanta, we have a triad of which Bodhi represents infinite benevolence. Bodhi is the love that has no imperfection, no distortion, no selfishness, no self-interest. It is infinite love, infinitely manifesting throughout space as the proof of the presence of the divine power. In other words, manifesting always through love. The eternal light comes into the life of the individual. Therefore, the immaculate birth of Buddha is also very symbolical of the immaculate birth of truth in the human soul. This is the purpose of the story. It is that we should suddenly come to realize that we must personally accept the invitation to bring into our own lives and through our lives into the world a manifestation of infinite love. Now, in the story, of course, we have the case of the Immaculate Conception again. The Buddha enters into Maya's body through the right side on a lotus throne supported by an elephant, which was Ganesha, the symbol of wisdom, the symbol of propriety. In the Indian mythology, Ganesha was quite an interesting character who gradually became much involved in merchandising. But the real truth behind Ganesha was wisdom, but wisdom as integrity. Wisdom was useless if it did not create honor. Wisdom was meaningless if the wise were not good. Now, wisdom, assumedly, cannot be attained without virtue. Therefore, worldly wisdom, as we find in the story of Pilgrim's Progress, can't be real wisdom at all. But in wisdom, the Bodhisattva was brought into the body of Mahamaya. And at that same instant, a blue lotus flower was placed in her hand as the symbol of the Annunciation. And of course, it's interesting that in many European figures, the Virgin Mary, at the time of the Annunciation, is given a lily by the angel. This lily is again part of the same thing. And in the case also Mahamaya, we find another interesting parallel. She is associated very closely with the moon, which in a mysterious way is under her feet. Anyway, Mahamaya becomes the mother of the Buddha. She is purity, becoming the mother of truth. She is that which is undefiled, becoming the basis and the power of redemption. And undefiled means finally and ultimately that all conduct is motivated by integrity, that all affection is honorable, and that in love and love alone can the true human being be brought into embodiment with the greatest potential for growth.
So we see from Surya and Maya come Buddha, or Bodhi, which is personified as Buddha, or in Christianity, Christ. So the father principle and the mother principle unite, or separate and then reunite to form the third principle, which is of the Trinity, which is Christ. And this doctrine is actually the centerpiece of the Bodhisattva teaching, the ideal of the Bodhisattva, because the Bodhisattva is the individual who has married these two principles, the solar and lunar principle, within themselves. And so he's going to be talking about that coming up, and then he's also going to be talking about the relationship between this Bodhi principle, which is the soul, and in the form of love, like the pure soul power of love, and then Manas, which is the mind, which is the intellect. So you can think of the Bodhi and Manas as being a polarity of mind, and the Bodhi is the higher nature, the soul nature, and then the Manas is the lower objectification of mind in the form of the intellect. And Manas, the root word Manas, you see man, and the human being is the individual in nature who embodies this Manas quality. So Atma, Bodhi, Manas become a trinity of principles, and they represent, Atma is the consciousness principle, and then Bodhi and Manas represent this polarity of mind. And then these unite to form the actual objectification of mind into form. And that'll be coming up after, that discussion will be coming up after this next clip.
But this light, which we don't understand, this infinite life, is the thing that created everything that exists. It is the ultimate of wisdom. It is the ultimate of beauty. It is the ultimate of virtue. There is nothing that exists without it, and nothing that possesses it can cease to exist. All things, therefore, are part of an incredible, inconceivable, eternal value, eternal reality. To try to define this in the simple terms of human experience is vanity. We can't explain it because we have not yet fully experienced it. All that we know of it now will be represented by little sparks, momentary senses of illumination or enlightenment. But the great value is beyond our estimation. But toward it we are moving. Therefore, the motion behind all things is toward perfection. And perfection is reunion with the infinite. Perfection is the end forever of the imperfections which cause mortal existence and mortal strife. Therefore, to the Buddhist concept, the revelation of life is this inner experience, this something or other that we all have to face or go through. Therefore, we can say, if we wish, that mortal persons, men and women alike, are all aspects of Maya Buddhism, the mother. We are all mothers because through us truth must be born. We are parents because it is through us that the eternal light must come into manifestation. We will be invited to accept this destiny, simply because by so doing we sacrifice nothing that is real, retain everything that has eternal value. Now, some people will say, well, that may be true, but in this eternal pattern of things, all my own personal desires are threatened. I want to do certain things myself. I want to be myself. I want to continue to exhibit my own competitive relationship with other creatures. And that, we would say then, that man declines to become the embodiment of the infinite. He is not ready yet. He must have a little more experience. He must gradually outgrow the illusions which he now regards as important. He must triumph over his own weaknesses, his own inabilities, and his own fallacies. Now, this is also more or less conditioned in the life of Buddha by the illumination scene. Buddha became a holy man. He became a searcher after truth. In the carvings and sculpturings of him, we see some in which he is nothing but skin and bones because he has fasted in search of reality. Everywhere he has sought truth. He has had the visions of the sick and the dying and the ignorant persons. He has renounced his kingdom. He has renounced his family. He has gone alone in search of the reality of life. Therefore, finally, in the great illumination scene, we find that he gains that which was the fulfillment of his original purpose. He is surrounded by the beings who have gone before him and who have found the way as he has found it. He has kept the truth. The deities of darkness, Mara, the principle of illusion, retires under the earth. Temptation fails. He is beyond all temptation, and in that way, in the silence of the night, he attains the Buddhahood. Having become the Buddha, he gives the rest of his life to the ministry.
In this clip, he's going to disambiguate between the principles of Bodhi, or soul, and manas, and mind, and we just talked about that a moment ago, but he's going to go into some detail on that.
Now, the Buddha is in each individual a factor which may be called Bodhi. Bodhi is enlightenment, luminosity. Bodhi is power of soul. Now, the soul is a symbol of a link, as Walt Whitman has also poetically mentioned, is a link between spirit and mind. The mind, which can be and often is the slayer of reality, represents worldliness brought to its highest capacity in the scholar, in the sage. We have here then the individual attempting to understand an embodiment of a divine power within himself. It is really not exactly that either. You have to hunt for just the right words. It is not that it is embodied at that time, because it is always there. But the embodiment becomes apperceivable. The individual becomes aware of this embodiment. So it is assumed that the embodiment takes place when awareness of it is achieved. But it is there all the time. It was the seed of it, the Buddha seed, was there while the spirit was itself still merely an atom in space. So in the story, each individual has to become the immaculate parent of truth. The body has to become the servant of the infinite. It has to be rededicated to the purposes for which it was originally fashioned.
So earlier we talked about how the animus needs to be led by the anima, and that is really illustrated here when he says that mind comes to light through love. So mind would be the animus aspect of this soul-mind intermediary principle, and then the soul would be the anima element. So you have mind and soul as the animus and anima, and so the mind comes to light through love. Light being the higher octave of the mind, this sort of divine light. And so the basic system of religious philosophy is built around this concept, because the soul is given the name Bodhi, which is Buddha, and then mind is given the name Manas, which is man. So you have Buddha and man. And actually, you have this term, the Manushi Buddha, which is the human Buddha, and that's the ideal, that's the archetype for humanity, is the human Buddha. And the human Buddha is a manifestation of Bodhi, the principle of Bodhi. So that's what he was talking about there. Now, next we're going to be looking at how all these elements that we've been talking about really synthesize in this Mahayana framework of religious philosophy and its idealistic and humanistic message. And so this for me is not the one solution that we're looking for. Like, we don't all need to become Mahayana Buddhists, but we need to learn from Mahayana Buddhism the core framework and core approach and core doctrine that we can apply to and we can universalize to a natural sort of a philosophy based on a natural religion. And this is the kind of philosophy that or mythology that we were talking about a few months ago in our video, Modern Man in Search of a Myth. And so if you haven't watched that, please watch that. And this is also just in general the worldview that we're looking for that can become universal and guide mankind to a new higher state of civilization, a new higher state of unfoldment. And this is a philosophy that has to be one that incorporates science. So it needs to transcend Mahayana Buddhism, which is from an area that is pre-science. So we need to take in more influences now. But when we're going back and looking at the 12th century AD and the 4th century AD, and we look at the revelations of knowledge that took place, Mahayana Buddhism is what we're going to look at. We're looking at other systems too, but this is the one that preserves the Aryan tradition, wisdom tradition, most directly as a system of religious philosophy. So now we need to add the outer body of science into it. Now the inner body of science is represented here through the disciplines of meditation. And based on the fact that this whole system is really crafted from a type of meditation science, where you have these sages forming this doctrine through what they're experiencing, the realities and truths that they experience in meditation. So it is scientific in that aspect, but it isn't connected to an outer body, an outer institution of science, because that didn't exist back then, but exists today. And so this whole effort that I'm trying to do is build the foundation of philosophy so that we can now turn and look at how to apply this. And my idea is to clothe it in this language of design ultimately, but that's getting ahead of things. So let's hear from Manly Hall again on the Mahayana system and its basic concept, how it synthesizes all these concepts.
Thus, we start in to contemplate the problems of the virtues as we find them in the Buddhist fable. In the first place, we know that the Buddhist commandments are rather different from ours, but have the same basic ethical implications. But a modern Mahayana Buddhist does not feel that the great achievement is through renunciation. The Southern Buddhist makes renunciation very strong. The original revelation of the initiation of Buddha makes renunciation very strong. But in modern thinking, in more recent times, since the beginning of the Christian era, the path of Buddhism has been one of fulfillment, of a rather joyous state of things, a kindly and pleasant realization. This realization is that the search for virtue is a joyous kind of dance. It is not some burdensome, frustrating, tiring thing. One thing that makes it more simple is that the light we seek cannot come until we are tired of the things that hurt. Hurting is a kind of prodding. Hurting is a continuous statement of our own ineptitudes. When hurting comes, ignorance is somewhere not far away. Even physical pain can be exaggerated by the hurting of futility, where the individual has no idea, no hope, no concept of why things happen. Now, it is not often that we will find a person who has lived a long life without some pain. It is part of existence. But the purpose that the Buddhist seeks to achieve is not necessarily that he won't hurt anymore, but rather that the hurting becomes part of a recognized good, that pain is necessary to the correction of ill, that if we did not have the symptoms that hurt, we would never find a remedy for the malady. So all the problems of living are part of a growing process. And out of this growing comes the realization that Bodhi is within ourselves. The great throne of the Buddhist experience is within the human heart itself. In the northern school of the heart doctrine, the Buddha is represented seated in the human heart, either by his appearance or by his symbol or by the ideoglyph that represents him. He is therefore the desired of all nations. He is the one who comes to heal the sorrow of the world. His miracle is perfection. His entire fulfillment is the taking over of the life. And in this taking over, every person who accepts the ministry is in a sense a Shakti. In other words, the acceptor is the feminine part of the transaction, because it is the one to whom is entrusted the bringing forth of the perfect soul and also the creation of the perfect world. The birth of the perfect soul is a symbol of the final redemption of the entire cosmic system.
So what we're getting at here is one of the core elements of the esoteric doctrine, which is this goddess worship, this goddess element. And part of that, this idea of worshiping, is that you become receptive, that you try to yourself become the Shakti of your higher self, the consciousness of the higher self. And he says that the adept is the Shakti of the Buddha. It becomes a vehicle of its light. So that's part of, and Taoism is called the way of heaven. It's the idea that you become receptive to the energies emanating from the stars and from the planets. That it's man's proper way to learn how to become receptive. So we don't lead, we learn how to follow. Heaven leads. That's the way of heaven. That heaven leads and man follows. Or Bodhi leads and Manas follows, or your anima leads and your animus follows, if you can see the pattern here. And the next clip, we're going to be looking at the virgin symbolism and why the goddess principle is associated with the virgin. And you'll see right behind me here, there's a little flag of Virginia, which is the state I live in. And on the flag is depicted Pallas Athena, which is a deity, a goddess within the Greek pantheon, and is involved with this mystery of not only goddess worship, but also the mystery of becoming one with the goddess and becoming the Shakti of your higher self, is involved with this mystery of Pallas Athena. And Pallas Athena was also one of the sort of patron goddesses referenced by Francis Bacon, and we'll be talking about Francis Bacon later on in this series because he is a pivotal character. So let's continue on with this next clip. And then we have one final one that follows.
So we are told that when Surya, the sun god, sought out the person in whom he would dwell for 3 years before he was born as Buddha, he found this pure wife of the Indian king. She was again the virgin, the symbol of purification. In this case, she was to be the anointed instrument of the embodiment. Her purity, therefore, becomes a symbol of the purity of all the Shakti that have to become involved in the bringing of the world Savior. In other words, only to the pure of heart can the mystery come. Only to those who by nature have quietly and lovingly improved their own characters. Only through such persons can the Bodhi power within themselves be released. The release of this spiritual value can never come through hate, through war, through strife, through corruption, through dissipation, or for any reason other than that the person through whom it comes has achieved internal purity. Now, purity in Buddhism means freedom from illusion. Purity is the individual who cannot be led away by falseness. Therefore, there is something about it, as in the case of some of these Christian legends also, there is something about this virginity of the mother that bears witness to a kind of childlikeness, uncorrupted, undefiled, untouched by false values because of purity of inward heart. Only this is, therefore, the proper parent of enlightenment. Illumination comes to the pure of heart, and those who live as far as humanly possible in peace with all other living things. Now, we're going to see some of this coming along one of these days right here in our society. We're going to see that all this violence, all this clamor, all this pomp and circumstance is going to gradually fade away because it is solving nothing. All this effort to fight our way to peace, this effort to work our way to wealth and be happy at the same time, all these false values have to go, and the ability to rise above them gradually redeems the person. Every truth seeker who is honest, everyone who really recognizes the need for greater inner strength, is therefore becoming more and more a person of purity of heart and mind. It's interesting to note that in early English and other languages, the word virgin was not limited to the feminine. One of the kings of England was called the Virgin King. It was simply a symbol of integrity, of purity of motive, of purity of intention, and of the living of a righteous life in a world of temptations. So the idea of the achievement of the virgin self, the coming of the mother of the mystery before the mystery itself can be born, indicates the idea that in the heart doctrine, love becomes the mother of enlightenment. Love becomes the mother not only of human enlightenment, but in some mysterious way, expanded beyond our comprehension, becomes the one great gate that leads into the infinite. All other factors are secondary to the unselfish love of one human being for another, and of all human beings for their creating power. All these things are substanced in the Buddhist teachings. There are all kinds of legends and fables about all of these things, but every one of them has something to do with the fact that the inner person is the mother of truth, that this inner person is the love of truth, is the purification of life, and is the consecration of conduct, until finally it is the perfected soul that brings forth the Redeemer. This all becomes part of a world message. It is everywhere among the doctrines of mankind, because it is always something that has come out from within the being itself. These different religions are the human being's gradual unfolding of their own potentials. Little by little we demand a different type of deity because we are becoming a different type of being. The God of battles is no longer our saints. We no longer respect authority, power, despotism, and tyranny. We no longer expect to be slaves of some eternal despot whom we can never understand and from whose tyranny we can never escape. This type of theology is gone. And the kind of theology also that teaches or tries to teach us that because of a few short years in this world, our eternal destiny is measured, that we must go to some other place and suffer forever for sins committed by our own ignorance. These things simply will not fit into the Buddhist philosophy of life. Rather, it is always a case of growth. And I think it's also important to remember in thinking of the law of reincarnation and karma as taught in Buddhism. Buddhism does not teach that karma goes on forever and that forever we make the same mistakes, forever we suffer for them, and we keep on suffering and going on, and as a result of eternal mistake, we are eternally reborn. This is not the Buddhist idea at all. We are not here to go on forever by rebirth. We are here to release ourselves from the wheel of the law by transcending the level of living which caused the mistakes. In other words, we are not punished but once for any one thing. And punishment is not necessarily painful. Punishment is recognition of realities. And the individual who outgrows a fault corrects it. He does not have to be tyrannized forever. The end is not punishment. The end is revelation. When the individual sees the reasons, understands them, and corrects them in himself, he is therefore in that time released from the wheel of karma. He is released from the wheel of rebirth.
So what Manly Hall is really sharing here is Buddhism's, or Mahayana Buddhism's doctrine of salvation. And it's based on the principle of love, which is the same teaching as Jesus. It's the same heart doctrine in both cases. So with Mahayana Buddhism, we get a sense of what Christianity could become with its inner heart aspect connected back to it. You know, this comparison kind of clarifies the purpose of the Apocalypse of St. John, which is, you know, the end prophecy of end days prophecy, quote unquote, of the Bible. But what it actually is a concealed mystical doctrine in that, or mystical teaching in that symbolism of the apocalypse. And what it references, or the experience that it's referencing, it really has to do with this idea of revelation. So Manly Hall says that the ultimate end is revelation. The ultimate end of all this process of life that we're going through is to become enlightened and to have the truth revealed. So there's a meaning and purpose. And I have one more clip now, and this one's actually long. I'm going to let it ride out and in my commentary here. But this is really on the Bodhisattva doctrine and the way of the Bodhisattva, and how this way is the way of Christ and the way of Buddha. It is the true Christianity, and the true Buddhism is this way of the Bodhisattva, this way of salvation through love. And this is something that we're going to be talking about in my upcoming article as well. More the details of how this heart doctrine is portrayed in the Mahayana system. But for now, we're going to hear Manly Hall give his take on it, and he does something here that he doesn't normally do. I haven't really heard him do very often in his lectures. Is he actually at one point sounds a little bit moved, like emotionally moved by this discussion of this Bodhisattva vow. And my feeling is that this is a vow that he knows intimately, because I look at him as being someone who embodied this ideal of the Bodhisattva, and that he was actually in his own way a Bodhisattva, someone who came to teach, who incarnated through this Bodhisattva vow, who was beyond the need to incarnate at this particular moment in time, but did so as part of this greater alchemical transformation of himself into a higher initiate or an adept, and in the process he left us this beautiful doctrine. And so I feel like that maybe explains a little bit why he is so moved here in this upcoming part. So anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. God bless. Thank you to Manly Hall as always, and please follow my Substack if you haven't already, and my new article will be coming out. I do want to also mention that sometimes I'll edit, or often I'll edit the grammar after I send out the initial email. So if you get the email, at whatever point you want to read it, just click the link, and the latest version at that point will be the one that's directly on the website rather than in your inbox. Because I'm like the last article, for example, I modified it quite a bit in the course of doing the video about it. I went back over the article and I changed a few things. So that's why I recommend going right to the website to actually read the article. But hopefully, eventually, I'll have a hard copy in book form of all these articles put together. But yeah, final clip here from Manly Hall, and this is really beautiful. And thank you very much.
The enlightened soul only returns by voluntary intent. Those who have gone a long way in enlightenment, or those who are in great need of more travel, but are aware of the facts, are born again. But the great and illumined soul is born perhaps with the greatest importance, because it is a voluntary action. The Bodhisattva's rebirth is a voluntary action. Now, in the case of Buddha, there is a very interesting story about this. As a bodhisattva over a period of ages, he paid all his karma, went through all the embodiments shown by the carvings on the walls of the Borobudur in Java, and at last he came to the final decision to attain the nirvana. But there was one debt he had not paid, a debt from way back, a small and insignificant karmic occurrence, but was not finished. But it was that unfinished business that made it possible for him to come back, which was another side of their philosophical thinking. So when the poor man gave him the tainted food because he had nothing else to give, and Buddha ate it, and as a result died, he told his disciples that in accepting this tainted food, he had passed his last test. He had made right the last wrong in his existence, and therefore, having attained this, he could then go on. But instead of going on, he held that fault for ages in order to be able to come back. It was the doorway through which he could come back until he corrected it. This is kind of an interesting sidelight on some of the symbolism involved in these stories. One of the most beautiful stories, I think, of that, of course, is the Bodhisattva doctrine of Northern Asia. As we look upon the magnificent statuary and paintings and images of Japan and Korea, we see these wonderful, radiant, luminous figures of the Bodhisattva, which means the enlightened soul, the enlightened self, the enlightened being. The Bodhisattvas are the ones who have gone all the way except the last step. And there is a story of the Bodhisattva Kannan, or Kuan Yin, that at last, having gone through all the sorrows of life, having been reborn in every kingdom in order that it might know the pain of living things, having taken the obligation of harmlessness to all that lived, this being was now able to face perfection. And as it stood at the gates of the infinite to go through, it heard a funny little cry, and looked and saw a tiny birdling in a nest, the mother dead beside it. And in that moment, the Bodhisattva took the great obligation of renunciation, and took to itself the vow that it would not attain the liberation or accept it until it could take every living thing, including the soul of that little bird, with it into the infinite. Beautiful little legend. Beautiful. It tells us something, all of us. And here on Mother's Day, it seems to me a very good thing that it does, because it helps us to understand a lot of life that we pass through too lightly and too insignificantly. All that we are striving to do in our best moments and in the moments of our own enlightenment, we are striving to be useful, to help all that lives, because in this way we achieve the full labor of the Shakti, The Great Mother comes in all of us when love takes precedence over every other emotion in life. It comes when a complete renunciation of self ends selfishness. A complete renunciation of gentleness ends all hate, stress, and tension. And I think today maybe we are in great need of this kind of a religion, this kind of an attitude towards life. Under the pressure of our economic situations and political stress and international complications, the individual is moved to attitudes that are not right for him. He hates. He is belligerent. He despises. He gossips. He condemns. He is forever looking for the wrong in things. And in so doing, he locks himself in the illusion of his own material attitudes. I think there is something to be said for Buddhist mysticism, which could be carried over into any religion. In other words, Buddhism is not primarily interested in making Buddhists. It is not interested just in converting anybody to anything. What it is interested in is seeing all human beings living nearer to a purpose of universal peace, of universal accord, of universal understanding, of universal affection and regard. And therefore, in this case, the Son, or the Eternal, comes to each person and asks the right to come in. This is Christ knocking at the door. Each person has the right to accept into itself this power. A dedication to the release of soul power, which is to be found by gentle meditation, prayer, thoughtfulness, consideration, and the gradual disciplining of false attitudes. If the individual becomes capable of eliminating most or the greater examples of his own inconsistencies, both the Buddhist and many other religions have also a formula represented by Yakushi Niori, the Buddhist deity of healing, the healing power of the truth. That in some mysterious way, even physical sickness often has to give way to enlightenment. It can be strangely made better. There is also a very interesting formula about the great physician in the Buddhist doctrine. And the great physician came to each person who was sick, but they rejected him because his medicines were not pleasant to them. He told them frankly that the healing medicine was that by which the soul was changed. So they rejected him, and he went his way. And no one paid any attention to him because they wanted to have health through excess rather than through discipline. And so one by one they got sicker, until finally, in desperation, they called the great physician back and agreed to follow his instruction. When they did, they got well, and everyone lived happily ever after. The great physician is, in the Buddhist doctrine, the power of love over hate. It is the power of tranquility, the power of the great paternal feelings that we have. And it is represented very largely when each person becomes a parent of others. Each person becomes the immaculate parent for the incarnation of the great light of the world. These things are perhaps also shadowed down into our material existence. And on Mother's Day, it is very good to think of some of these things, because there is a tremendous power in the simple fact of motherhood itself, by which life is changed and transformed, and each individual moves from merely part of a pattern to one of those who is becoming a creator, someone through whom life is to come into the world. And in this life, we have the physical. But in the philosophical level, this light becomes the mystical. And light as physical perpetuates the species. light as mystical perfects the whole world and all that inhabits it and all that works through it. So on this day, let's be very grateful for those who have brought life to this world through the natural laws of maternity, and also realize that this embodiment is a symbol, a very beautiful and wonderful symbol, in which the cherishing of life, in which the mystical experience that the individual goes through in the process of bringing forth a physical child, is in a mysterious way surrounded by the presence of universal laws and principles which also have to do with the production of the soul. This human soul is born through the mind and through the body. It is precipitated from the spiritual life of the individual. It becomes finally the heir to all the ages, and it is the child that will never be a pain to its parent. This bringing forth of the sun child, the soul child, the Buddha child in ourselves, is the gradual unfoldment of the eternal through the temporal, of the invisible through the visible. The principle will not be seen, but it will be made known by its preachments. And the preachments in this case represents the conduct, donations and contributions to world good, and everything that can be done to make a better life. So there's constantly coming into this world souls that are brought here, if by love, by the strongest power there is, and that the entire experience of physical love has its absolute equivalent on the higher planes by the mystical experience of soul love. And without love, there is nothing but sterility. Without love, there is nothing but death. And with love, there is everlasting life. So the gradual transformation of ourselves into the love principle is more or less a feminizing process. It is making the principle of love stronger than the principle of law, but does not break the law, because the law itself arises in an infinite consciousness of love. The law is there because it is necessary to the fulfillment of the great affection of the universal parent for its children. So all in the world we can really hope for is that gradually private people in their daily living will begin to live closer to the realities of good, that little by little our failings will be transformed by a kind of affection. When we love someone very dearly, we will sacrifice much for them. Their happiness becomes more important than our own, and we never can be happy until something or someone else is more important than ourselves. All the way through, the world of law was the world of the prophets. The world of law was the old dispensation. But the understanding of the law, not its abolishment, but the understanding of the law becomes the new dispensation, because it is that by which we gradually come to understand that law itself has no existence except as an instrument of love. As the parent must correct a child, so universal law, because it loves creation, corrects its mistakes. Little by little, we move into a more rarefied and gentle atmosphere of relationships with things. We are no longer quite so heavily indoctrinated with the passing moods and attitudes that make up most of our lives. It is a good thing, perhaps, in this day of the year when we become very much remembering of our parents and those that we've known, and we remember the half-forgotten and the half-remembered. It is nice to realize that this whole pattern, everything involved in it, is nothing but divine love coming to age in the human being. And also that when the human being becomes an instrument of the divine love, then the solar system is in order. And all the worlds that are continue to fulfill their destinies under the loving care of infinite life, light, and truth. These things, if we think about them, may help us to have a little happier day today and look forward to something nice tomorrow. Thank you very much.